Hi, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to House Education on January 7th, 2026. So we have essentially two rounds of.
Michael's here as well.
Okay, great. We have two rounds of testimony this morning. First, the report from the School Construction Advisory Group. They were tasked with making some recommendations on if we move to larger districts, what to do about shared or how do we deal with debt. But it's also an opportunity to sort of get an update from them as to their work in general, sort of next steps for them in the absence of state aid itself. And then we will move on to the report of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. And we've got plenty of time, so if people have questions, that's great. Go for it. So this morning we have two members of the advisory group on school construction aid. Going to have them talk about their report specifically, but also I think it would be great if the two of you wanted to just talk about sort of what is the ongoing work in the absence of money, and just sort of any further thoughts you have as to sort of how we wrestle with the colossal need for school renovation in our state. But with that, I don't know if the two of you had a chance to sort of talk and see who wants to lead the conversation, but happy to hear from you, and we can start talking specifically about the report itself if you'd like.
Sure.
Welcome, and the floor is yours.
I can probably kick things off to set the context, and I know David has some jumping off points from my presentation, if that works.
That's great. David, you appear unmuted, but we cannot hear you. Yeah, no problem. Michael, if you're welcome to sort of kick things off on the report itself.
Okay, great.
Introduce yourself and
yeah,
be great.
Nice to see everyone. Michael Gaughan, Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. Apologies, I needed a bigger screen to see all of you, so I'm looking at a screen that makes it look like I'm not looking at you directly. But welcome back. Another year, another chance to talk about school construction in Vermont. 5 years going in a row here. So this summer's work was the group, the advisory committee, I think it's called officially, was charged with coming up with some options for what to do with legacy debt in the event of school consolidation. This is, of course, something that we have dealt with previously with prior consolidations. As background on that, the way we handled it was we essentially changed the billing entity, the name of the entity that received the bills, and as a matter of law, codified as well in the Articles of Agreement, the debt sort of followed the new consolidated district. So that's kind of the precedent in which we entered into this. And so we haven't had much time to talk about anything else. This was really the work. And as David and I talked about, I think an important point here is in the memo that was provided, we really laid out the options. Didn't really speak to the preference of any one of those options, but we can talk about that a little bit in the context of some of the background materials I'm about to share. So some of these are in the report, but I thought it helpful just to go over them quickly. Can folks see my screen?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so you've probably seen this many times before. This is a history, as the bond bank understands it, of school construction bonds in Vermont, which are highly correlated with the school construction itself. This is only the bond bank for all of these slides. This is only the bond bank's data plus Burlington and Winooski. If there are private bank loans with schools, we don't, that's not something we really know about other than occasionally seeing it in their audits. But for the most part, we think this, is 90+% of the picture of of school bonds in the state. So as you see, there's obviously been an uptick in the last few years, no surprises. But the story here is that all these schools that were built in the 70s are at the end of their useful life, and that's why we have such a hole to dig out of. We talked about this a little bit, and David has some really well, actually, I'm gonna introduce this and probably just have David jump in here because I think it makes sense for him to speak to this. But one thing we spoke about was just the rate of construction inflation. That bar in the middle. This is PPI, non-residential construction goods. Folks can quibble about whether this is an appropriate index, but certainly it shows the level of cost escalation over the last 6 years. The bar in the middle there around 2020 is the COVID recession, and then you see it kind of jumps. It's crazy, crazy high construction inflation, and so there's some consequences of this for how we think about existing school debt. So, David, this is your brilliant point, so I'll let you jump in on this.
If you can.
I was trying to dial in, I suppose.
Can you hear me?
We got an echo.
Hold on one second.
Okay, well, I think we're okay.
How about now?
Good.
Okay. So, oh boy.
Yeah, a little bit.
How about now?
I think it's okay.
Okay.
And don't forget to introduce yourself as well.
Yes. My name's,
Ooh.
I have an echo. Hold on.
Yeah.
I'm Dave Epstein. I'm an architect. I do a lot of work on schools. I've been very involved with school construction aid, trying to get it resurrected over the last 8 years. And so I bring a lot of both boots on the ground experience, but also.
David, I'm going to interrupt for just a second. The suggestion is you could turn the volume down on your computer.
Okay.
That might get rid of the echo.
How's that?
Much better.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the average, construction cost is escalating. You can see radically during COVID, and it's starting to abate a little bit. We've done several studies with several districts showing that bonding for projects in today's dollars saves a tremendous amount of money over the long haul versus trying to pay for it through capital reserves. And obviously this points out the cost of inaction because every year you don't do any work, it just continues to rise at an incredible pace. The $6 billion number that's been thrown around for deferred maintenance, every year that goes by, that's $240 million, just to put that in perspective.
Yeah, and the other point David has made, and maybe he can articulate, is that with the rate of construction cost inflation, having debt on your books isn't necessarily a bad thing. A little bit depends on the vintage of that debt, but what that indicates is that really that facility has had some investment that could not be bought at the same level in today's dollars.
Yeah, I think we were, the whole question we were posed almost had a faulty premise, which was that bad debt was bad and other districts wouldn't want to assume it, which is probably partially true. But as Michael points out, it could represent that a district has invested in their facilities. Now you have a known cost as opposed to an unknown cost. If you think about, if you were, in a commercial setting, if you were buying a bunch of buildings, if they were in good shape, you'd be more likely to want to purchase those as opposed to ones in poor shape.
So I think that's kind of that was a key point. That was kind of an aha moment in our discussions over the summer. So I just want to make sure that was yeah, we spent some time on that. So
By that, you mean, for example, Burlington's carrying a high level of debt, but at the same time, they have a brand new building that isn't going to be carrying the cost of a building that is past its useful life.
Precisely, precisely. CVU is kind of textbook on this. They've done a really good job at investing in facilities, passing relative to the size of the district, modest bonds authorizations, but they've kept up on the plant and it's in really good shape. So that's, on paper, they might look like they have a higher debt load, but they have a much smaller deferred maintenance liability.
And we've seen this, I think it's the Mount Abraham district who has budgeted significantly more than other districts because they were unable to pass the bond. And when we did facility evaluations across that district, they had substantially lower deferred maintenance across the board than other districts. That's not a case situation. That's not a bonding situation, but it is an investment situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, the last point here is that the rate of construction cost inflation is well above the cost of borrowing. Um, and so that drives a lot of these economics as well. So with regard to the actual amount of the ed fund that's currently occupied by debt service, this is what it looks like over the next, over the lifetime of existing debt. 2026 is a bit of an anomaly. There were these curious things after the Great Recession called qualified school construction bonds. And the way they work is you fund a sinking fund over time, and then there's a big principal payment at the end. So this is a little bit misleading because there is a sinking fund in the background for this. But generally, just under $50 million in debt service a year that's going towards uh, um, bond repayments. But which sounds like a big number until you consider the overall size of the ed fund, and this is like a drop in the bucket compared to the other costs. I think our median amount of budget that is occupied by debt service in our portfolio is less than 2%, which compares to national medians of over 5% for similarly sized school districts. So again, it's not telling you anything you don't know, but the scale of debt in terms of the concerns of education finance in the state is relatively small, I think is what that really tells us.
I think actually, there was something that I didn't realize is that the level of debt out there in comparison to the whole cost of education is so minor, with
Right.
the exception of a couple of anomalies
Right.
like Burlington and Winooski and Colchester.
Right, but even those school districts are, even though they seem very large, I'd say that as a percentage of their budget, they're even a little bit below national medians, which is interesting. So they seem really big to us, but it's just relative to the lack of investment everywhere else.
And I think one of the things we talked about in the committee, that this whole, we spent a few months talking about this. It's a little bit of a red herring, but it's from a financial standpoint, but it could be an emotional issue as districts, contemplate what it means to be together.
Yeah.
So then the next slide here is just a breakdown per county. I think it doesn't tell us anything we don't know. And I've got a better slide to speak to this in just a moment. This slide in particular I thought was pretty helpful. It shows the overall amount of debt per county, concentrated obviously largely in Chittenden, but also significant amounts in Franklin and Windsor, where more recent bonds have been able to be passed. It's obviously out of whack with the sort of allocations of school-age children per county because of Chittenden. Once you strip away the top 10 largest borrowers, though, I think the numbers become really interesting. You only have $72 million of outstanding debt, which is very, very small. But does, afford some opportunities to kind of win the peace, if you will, with regard to consolidation at a low dollar amount. And we got into those in some of the options in the I guess the report. One thing that I thought was compelling to look at and we discussed is that the vintage of the debt matters. So kind of extrapolating from David's point a little bit, yes, debt is not a bad thing necessarily. It indicates investment in plant, which means less deferred maintenance. But the year of the vintage of the debt is also relevant because if you're near, if it's a 20-year bond and you're in year 19 of that, that's less useful than something more recent. But generally we have fairly fast amortization of our school bonds, and so there's not a lot of older debt. So as you consider potential options for dealing with legacy debt, the vintage of the debt I think is material to the discussion because newer debt is more valuable than older debt as depreciation occurs. So you see very little. I mean, the consequence here is there's very little debt that is older than say 13 years or so, and that's a lot of that is because during the post Great Recession era, there were some specific programs for school construction where the interest rate on the bonds is close to is less than, well, it was supposed to be less than 1%, but with sequestration, it ended up being just a hair more than 1%. Um, and then I think this is the last slide, but this is also in the report is just the, per school district. This is the amount of debt outstanding as we know it based upon the data we have, which again, we think is pretty comprehensive, but is there may be some things that small amounts that we're missing. So that's kind of, what I hope to share there. Again, the memo or I keep calling it memo, but the report considers several options, not all of which we think are, would necessarily be recommended, but that's sort of indicated in the if there's more pros for that option. I think the two that were compelling to me were, well, three really that we thought were probably the most relevant were just status quo, which is that the new district assumes the old district's debt, which we obviously have precedent for. On the bond bank side, we're simply changing the name of the obligor on that debt and sending the bill somewhere else. Two is similar to what we've discussed over many sessions with regard to new school aid, providing some sort of subsidy based upon the amount of debt service that the district pays. So the debt, again, the mechanism there to prevent it being net tax supported debt for the state would be that the district pays the debt service and then there's a reimbursement mechanism. This is what Rhode Island has used and we've discussed many times in the past. And then finally, one option that I thought was kind of interesting was to just pick an absolute number of debt forgiveness. We discussed $5 million in the report, and you wipe away the debt of almost every single district other than those that have passed bonds in recent times. I think the total cost would be 54 million, and all but 13 districts would have their debt burden completely eliminated. So very equitable, might be a way to provide some incentives. In all of these cases, the key is not issuing state debt to defeat or to remove this debt. There are some tax complications with that make it potentially more expensive. And it, as we've spoken about, the bond bank can really be more efficient in leveraging the state's rating for the purposes of school construction debt than the state can be directly. So those were kind of some of the key points there. So I'll stop talking here and allow David or committee to ask questions.
Just Michael, before David starts, would you just remind us of the term net state tax supported debt or the reverse of that or whatever and why it matters?
Yeah, so it's essentially the debt that's held by the state that is reviewed by the rating agencies, and the consequent in 2017 the state issued, I'm just going to kind of give you the long story so you understand the context, and I'm going to stop sharing so it makes it a little easier here, but 2017 the state issued a housing bond, which was great. It was an effort to sort of remove it from the state's balance sheet by using property transfer taxes that were given to Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And it was a really good mechanism, but lo and behold, the rating agencies evaluated it as basically tax supported debt. That's what we're talking about here. And so despite all the mechanisms, it was it was might as well have done it on a geo basis and saved a little bit of money to be honest. But so that just means that we're cautious about any kind of mechanisms to support uh, anything from the state through some sort of mechanism that might go to the school districts, but in effect is the state paying debt service. And so that's why it occurs on a reimbursement basis. There's you could make an argument that the state should just pick up the tab on some of this. That might be okay for the new construction costs, but for defeasing or retiring the old debt, it does really become quite complicated because of our underlying bonds have features on them that block early repayment. So you have to fund escrows, and there's some tax rules around that. Anyway, so a much cleaner way to do it is to have to have money that's not raised from issuance of bonds, but just an appropriation. But the next tax supported debt generally matters because the rating agencies review it as they review the state's rating. A really good state rating means the bond bank has a really good rating, and we have the ability to leverage more than the state can without any kind of material rating consequences because of the nature of the credit enhancement we use.
All right. So in other words, you sort of piggyback on the state's bond rating for, I guess we call it local debt through the bond bank. But ultimately it is tax supported. It's just sort of done differently so that it doesn't appear as a direct obligation of the state government. It's sort of on a different set of books that like uses the full faith and credit of the state.
It's not using the full faith and credit, and that's why it's not. I mean,
Okay.
it's kind of an interesting nuance with a statewide education fund and statewide property tax, but that hasn't been an issue to date. It is a peculiar nuance. Probably is less important if we move to a foundation formula, which is more consistent with other states. But I mean, I think the takeaway message is just like if we've got $6 billion in need, that amount of debt is going to have a material consequence on the state's rating, given all the other capital needs in the state. But through the bond bank, we think we can be more efficient on a comparative basis with leveraging the state's rating.
Representative Quimby.
I just want to make sure I heard correctly, if I understood it correctly. So did you say a $5 million appropriation rather than a bond would wipe out virtually all of the bond debt that the schools have?
A little bit
I didn't
different.
quite catch that.
Yeah. We describe it in the report.
Yeah.
If you said, okay, we're going to eliminate up to $5 million of debt
Okay.
for every single district in the state,
Oh, for
it would
each
cost the total appropriation you would need would be, I think, I'm going off memory here, I think 54 million.
Okay, that makes
It
more
would
sense.
eliminate any outstanding debt for all but 13 districts in the state.
Okay, thank you. That cleared it up.
Any other questions on some of this? Yeah, go ahead.
This is not, I just was curious about this. In looking at the first slide, the historical bond issuance activity. I know obviously that the 1971 spike was because that was when we were consolidating all the schools and building the new schools. What happened in the mid-90s that spiked it and then back down?
I
can
don't
answer
know.
that.
Okay.
There was a building boom during the first consolidation of the Union high schools in the late 60s, early 70s. And then there was actually a population spike in the early 90s. So there's quite a bit of construction in that during that period to accommodate the population spike.
And right after that population spike, the reverse happened. Immediately, aggressively.
I was just curious about that.
It was population.
Yeah.
Student enrollment.
We see a lot of buildings that were built in the 60s with additions in the 90s and haven't had any work since then.
Okay. Would you all sort of mind talking about sort of the future work of the advisory group, if any, especially in the sort of absence of any state funding for school construction?
Yeah, I could talk to that a little bit. Michael and I actually did meet yesterday to have a little pregame meeting, but we're going to be asked to put some flesh on the bones of the framework for school construction aid that was in Act 73. But what we were talking about was that there's really, the school construction aid program should be a program that implements state policy, on, and right now, I think it's going to be a challenge to put together a school construction aid program if we don't know what policy levers we're trying to move. And so I think we're going to need direction, whether it's from this committee or the Agency of Education. Is it newer and fewer, as Rhode Island likes to say, or is it, certain class sizes, certain school sizes, certain, regional, there's been talk about regional comprehensive high schools, because school construction aid is as it's a great carrot to move districts in the direction that, that is aligned with state policy. But I think as a committee, we need to know what that state policy is to be effective.
So, for example, if we were to say the state policy is that we want to only focus on larger comprehensive high schools, that gives you the direction you need to sort of build out a program.
Exactly. So that's the next step for us, I believe, is to start working on the framework that is in Act 73 and start okay, what are the incentives because it suggests a 20% contribution and then up to 40% based on different priorities. And what are those priorities? How do they work? How are they measured? How do you make them measurable? All that, I think, we'll have to, I think it's going to be a challenge without state policy guidelines to work towards.
Yes, that could be restated in many contexts. Yes.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, we're obviously concerned about cost overall, and the debt service burden. And I feel like for the most part, we spent the last 5 years sort of figuring that out. There's not going to be a lot of new discussion that hasn't been part of prior reports from our perspective. So that means, like I talked about before, it's going to be we would recommend debt service reimbursement, which we've talked about. We've also talked about the bond bank or some other entity sort of serving as like a fiscal agent to mechanically monitor who's paid debt service and then reimburse the right school and move the money at the right times. And then, not investing money. I mean, the one area where I think the bond bank gets away from just the mechanics of the thing is looking at these FCI scores and making sure that we are not, that we're doing things efficiently. We're not trying to renovate schools because of sentimental value that are well above their FCI scores of 65, 70% or above, and that we're really fully considering new construction as a more cost-effective option. So I think those are the three things that we're focused on. And as David says, the sort of incentive mechanisms need to be driven by overall policy and frankly aren't exactly in the middle for the bond bank. Those are programmatic questions more so.
Good.
I wanted to mention that in regards to our report, and I think Michael touched on this, that we listed 5 options, but it was really for the purposes of outlining, trying to iterate all the different options, and they are not equal, and some of them we would not recommend. The committee was reluctant to make a recommendation because they felt they were concerned about unintended consequences. And without seeing what the district maps looked like. For example, one of the concerns expressed was if a wealthier district that had debt was merged, redistricted with a less wealthy community, and they were having to assume that debt. Now, so that was a concern expressed, but I think one thing we all agreed on was that if you were taking advantage of that asset, if you benefited from that asset that might be part of the debt load, then you need to participate in helping pay for it.
Yeah, understood. I think that just your report this morning kind of gives me a different view of the negativity of debt, and perhaps it's not such a bad thing,
Yeah.
given that it reflects a more valuable asset. And so as I think about what you're telling me is if, for example, South Burlington merged with Burlington and sent all their high school kids to Burlington High School, one could say they really should assume that debt because they are now taking advantage of that asset.
Exactly. I think one sort of issue too is in one of the options, there's this debt subsidy repayment approach similar to Rhode Island. And I think one of the things that will have to be tackled with the school construction aid program is retroactive subsidies.
Yeah.
Does Burlington or Winooski or Colchester get a subsidized payment on their debt, even though they did the work before the school construction aid program? Because one of the things, as an architect, when I see around the state is I see a lot of districts sitting on the sidelines waiting for two reasons. One is they don't want to do anything until they can get some kind of state construction aid. And two, and I know this has been a constant conversation, is the per pupil capital construction now counts towards the per pupil spending, and they're afraid of hitting the penalty zone.
Yes.
They're having conversations yesterday with a district about saying, well, we can only afford to do this much work because we don't want to go into the excess spending threshold. So there's some, and it may be intentional because the legislature may want to have everybody wait until there is a program, but what we're seeing is there's this hesitancy to move forward with investments right now, which is only raising the ticket price.
Yeah.
Whole thing, the longer they wait. We have one project, I won't name the project. We started 10 years ago with this group, and they needed $20 million worth of work on their high school. That same exact scope of work is $80 million today. And that's the cost of waiting. So that's a concern, I think, that I think is worth considering as you navigate this particular subject.
Yeah, it spills over into not just bonded indebtedness, but so many other things that a lot of schools are sitting on the sidelines waiting for us to take action. Yeah, appreciate that comment.
Yeah, I might add a outside the box comment as well, just on this subject. So, and I've spoken about this before and pushed for it to be included in the task force report from 2 years ago. But, we just had a discussion about 54 million eliminating the debt service or the debt burden for all but 13 districts. But in my mind, the real challenge here is never going to be the debt for the reasons David has articulated, but is really going to be what happens with that community asset. And I know it's outside of the scope of this committee to some degree, but it truly is social infrastructure that matters for that community. And so 54 million towards renovation and reuse of those facilities for some sort of adapted use housing, whatever, I think would be as valuable, probably more valuable than eliminating debt. And a good investment for the state. And we care about that, because we lend to all the municipalities as well. And so we want to see thriving municipalities, even if their longtime school changes locations. So not to be forgotten, this conversation is it's quite interdisciplinary.
Excellent point.
Thanks. Anybody else, any other questions, comments? If not, thank you both very much for your time this morning and for the report and the recommendations. It's really helpful.
Great. Nice to see everyone. Talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right, that's good. All right, folks, we could call ourselves on break till 10:30 for our next